Good evening and welcome to the February AHDB Cereals and Oilseeds webinar. My name is Richard Meredith. I am the Knowledge Exchange Manager for the West of England and Wales, and I'm proud to be your webinar chairman tonight. As always, I'm just going to run through the webinar housekeeping rules. Can you click next slide? Sorry, hang on 1 minute. There we go. Sorry about that. Tonight's housekeeping points are you're all muted, so don't worry, we can't hear you. You've got misfortune of hearing me tonight. There's a question box on the right-hand side of your screen. If you've got any questions to ask, please do so. There's a Q&A period at the end of the session, but we do invite questions as we go through, and I'll stop the speakers and ask them. We're aiming to conclude around 8 o'clock. It's not set in stone. We'll see how we get on with content and questions as we go through. If there are any kind of slides that you want to see again, the webinar does get recorded and put onto the AHDB YouTube site within the next week. You've all got my contact details. If you've got any questions, please feel free to ring and email me. Right, so tonight's webinar. As always, I'm going to set the scene. These are your two speakers tonight, Blair Mckenzie and Rob Fox. We're sat in the President's Suite at the Three Counties Showground, having just all presented at the West Region Agronomy event, and we had a fantastic day. Tonight, Blair is our technical expert, and he'll be talking all tillage, soils and crops for us. And joining us as the farmer expert is Rob Fox. Rob will introduce himself in a moment, but he's a farmer from Leamington Spa, and I've worked with Rob for a few years now. I thank both gentlemen. Thank you at this point for making all the effort and joining us tonight. What I want to stress is that kind of we'll be talking about Rob's farm and what he's been doing, but it's obviously we're talking about his system, what he's doing on his farm. He's going to describe in a minute what he's doing, so it's not one size fits all on that front. Blair, at this stage, I'm going to pass over to you, give you the controller, and ask you to introduce yourself, and then we'll pass over to Rob. Here we go. Enjoy yourselves.
Thank you, Richard. It's good to be here. I'm Blair Mckenzie. I'm based at the Hutton Institute in Dundee in Scotland, and I've been in the UK for 16 years, working at the James Hutton, and prior to that, its predecessor organisation, the Scottish Crop Research Institute. I am by birth and upbringing Australian, and I trained in agricultural science at the University of Adelaide, and then did postgraduate work, particularly PhD, looking at the relationships between soil biology and soil physics, and soil structure, and I suppose my work over many years now has been I've been interested in managing soils to achieve long-term sustainable, if you like, plant production.
Rob, over to you.
Hi, thank you for having me. My name's Rob Fox. I am a farm manager from up near Leamington Spa. I'm originally from a family dairy and arable farm in Warwickshire. From there, I went to do an HND at Seal Hayne, which sadly is no longer with us. Went back home for 6 years after my HND. Helped my brother get things up and running again after Dad retired. And then decided to move away from the family farm and go and do my own thing. I spent a couple of years as a lead operator on a 2,500 acre arable joint venture business in Northamptonshire. And then from there, I moved to where I am now, where I've been the farm manager for 9 years. 2014 to 2017, I was the AHDB monitor farmer for the West region. And after a year's break, I decided to throw myself back into it. And so this year, or well, last year now, I became the AHDB Strategic Farmer for the West region, which will run from 2018 to 2024.
Glutton for punishment, I think.
The farm I manage just outside Leamington Spa is 1,000 acres of arable. And then I also am involved in and run an arable joint venture on a further 900 acres with another another few local farmers. We are on some varied soils, but a lot of it is very heavy clay, up to 65% clay content. I like to think, I hope my soil's in good condition. Maybe we'll find out otherwise tonight, but we're on some, like I said, we're on some heavy stuff. We have what I consider a high horsepower requirement. Heavy soils, very steep banks in places. Very varied soils and consequently very varied infield yields, with winter wheat ranging from 5.5 ton all the way through to 15.5 on the better ground, and likewise oilseed rates, spot rates on the yield monitors of 1 ton all the way up to 7.5. We like our technology. I like my precision farming. We're variably applying seed, all fertilizers, and through the purchase of a new sprayer, we're now looking at the possibility of varying some spray inputs as well. So as mentioned earlier on, I'm now the strategic farm for the West region for the AHDB. A few of the things that we're looking at in year one, crop nutrition there at the top. We are challenging our sort of farm standard nitrogen application through the season, mixing up with some different NPK-S products all the way through, even where indices suggest that we may not need any, to try and see if there's a yield response. We're looking at our disease management, and indeed whether we can lower, or how low we can take particularly some fungicide inputs on newer, cleaner varieties. That also affects our variety choice on that large split field trial. We are looking at how we establish our crops, and in particular, and we'll come on to it a bit more later, we have a depth of cultivation trial varying from just a few inches, and then drilling all the way through to sort of 6 inches and drilling, and then a foot deep as well with a deep tine. We're having a look there on the effect of the rooting in winter wheat, and also how the wheat performs through the season and all the way through to yield. We are very conscious of soil health and how important it is on our farm and how important it is going forward. So we're doing a lot of baselining, particularly in year one, to get a line in the sand as to exactly how healthy or not, as the case may be, are our soils, and that I think leads us nicely back to Blair.
Thanks, Rob. I think that the subject of soil health really relates to soil function and what we want the soil to deliver. Obviously, for arable crops, we want the soil to be soft and stable, and allows the roots of the crop, be it barley or wheat or oilseed rape, to proliferate through the whole depth of soil so that they can use all the soil resource effectively. We want the soil to drain excess water, but we also want it to hold water and nutrients. We want to be sure that the soil's not contaminated by pesticides or whatever, and we want it to have a good functioning biology, a biology that cycles nutrients and organic matter, and mineralizes the organic matter to release the nutrients. We want the soil to be free from pests and diseases, but increasingly we're putting heavier and heavier machinery, and we expect the soil to deliver trafficability for that machinery. So I think in many ways we are expecting and trying to get a lot from our soils. There are interactions, and where we get it right, there are some real benefits. So if we have soft, stable soil, the roots can proliferate and we get benefit from the whole depth of soil that we have. But when one thing goes wrong, it often leads to problems with others. And the example that I've got there on the slide is you can see that where the wheelings have gone, there's been a compaction issue, and where there's a compaction and in a wet winter, that's led to the erosion. So there are the threats to the functioning of the soil, the successful functioning of soil can combine, but also we can get synergies and to the benefits. And there's some examples there that we've got with compaction and erosion being a very topical and real problem.
So Blair, you mentioned there in that slide and the one before about wheelings and machinery, and what we've been trying to do for the last few years is reduce the wheelings in our system. We're on a managed or a controlled traffic system. After we've been through with a deep tine machine, then everything is then based on either a 6 meter width or above, with everything on a GPS. What work have you done on the effect of wheelings on the ground and underneath?
Well, I think that's one good point to pick up on, Rob, because I'm pleased you're considering the compaction problem and trying to confine it using controlled or managed traffic to the area. I think it's worth just taking a second or two to understand this figure here that I've just put up, which talks about how soil deforms. And this is what happens, how the soil deforms under a tractor going over it. So this is displacement shifting in the soil at 20 centimeters depth. And under the 0 in the top, near the middle of the screen at the top, you can see there's a 0. And that's the starting point. There's a dot, and the driving direction is from left to right. So as the tractor comes along, it pushes, the first thing that happens is it actually pushes the soil forward a bit. Then the weight of the front wheel comes on, it pushes the soil down. As the front wheel goes past, the soil comes back up, not all the way back to where it was, and then the back wheel comes along. And the back wheel again pushes the soil forward, so you can see we're out to beyond the 2 and towards almost the 4, and then the extra weight, the big axle load comes on, pushes the soil down, and after the wheel comes over, the soil moves back, it returns to its original position, and there is some rebound, but it of course doesn't rebound all the way. And the reason I think this is an important diagram is that it shows that there's not only a vertical axle load, but there is a shear going on with it. And if you think about putting a load on a bottle or a soft drink can, the can or the bottle can take quite a lot of weight. But if you jiggle the can or the plastic bottle backwards and forwards a bit, it will collapse very easily. And one of the problems with compaction is that with this bit of, it's not just it's the axle load that's very important, but also the shear that goes on collapses the vertical pores, the earthworm burrows, the old root channels that can give us drainage and drain away the water. So understanding the basics, and this was some work done with some colleagues now at the University of Kassel in Germany, but we understand what's going on. We understand the processes there. We've used a number of long-term experiments, we call them platforms, in work that was funded by the AHDB in a project titled Platforms. And we used a range of experiments, both in Scotland and run by colleagues, Nathan Morris and others at NIAB, the experiments there, and they have a range of scales. So at Midtown, we have small scale plots ranging up through to the Centre for Sustainable Cropping in Dundee, where we have very large 5 acre or more fields. And so we can ask a range of questions relating to compaction, to carbon. All these experiments or platforms have tillage systems. They all have a ploughed system, and they all have a shallow or non-inversion cultivation system. So we can use these to think about a range of issues with soil management.
So
can I butt in with a question there before it gets too far, before it's less relevant? It's actually from our panelist from last month, David Bell. Hi, David. David asked, does the displacement that you mentioned, does it increase at speed?
In general, yes, but it depends on the tyre tread and the machine that's being used. So it's not a simple linear thing. So going 100 miles an hour doesn't create. So it's not a linear response, but there are speed is part of the factor. Yes.
Excellent.
Blair, you mentioned it earlier on, and it's one thing that we're talking about more and more in UK agriculture, and also more and more relevant in the media, is soil carbon. What can you tell us more about that on the work you've done?
Well, thanks, Rob. We've used these long-term experiments that have been running for multiple years, so up to 10 or 12 years or beyond, to ask some questions under different tillage systems, what's happening to soil carbon. But I'll just make a few points to think in the context of carbon and soil health, is that we need to relate things to function. What the soil, of those things that I listed earlier about what the soil can do, what we want the soil to do, we want it to cycle nutrients. Well, so it's more than just carbon by itself. Carbon's just an element. We need it to be part of a functioning organic matter. So carbon is only an indicator for the whole organic matter that will cycle nutrients and these sorts of things. And if we want to measure and think about the amount of carbon or organic matter in the soil, then we've got to think over the entire soil profile, not just the top few millimeters, not even just to the plough depth, but all the way down. We've got to realize that if we took a cup of soil, then we've got an amount of carbon in there. But if we squash that soil into the cup even more, we'd end up with more soil, and so we'd end up with more carbon in the cup, or more organic matter in the cup. So we need to allow for and consider bulk density. And similarly, certainly where I am in Scotland, so we're on some very stony soils, the ability to interact with carbon or organic matter, the stone material won't help anything to do with the carbon or store organic matter. So we need to allow, if we're going to measure and understand carbon and organic matter cycling and quantities in soil carefully, we need to take a range of things, and it's not just a case of taking a quick sample from the surface soil.
So in the in the work that you've done, have you noticed a difference in establishment regimes of the soil carbon store?
Yeah, we've used these platform experiments where we've had long-term, multiple years under stable cultivation systems, so either ploughing or in non-inversion, or in one case in mid-Pilmer, we actually had a no-till system. And we've analysed and taken the time to take properly replicated samples to depth and allow for stone and carbon and bulk density differences. And that even after multiple years, 10 years of no-till, over the whole profile, we haven't seen an increase in the store of carbon within the soil. There's differences in the distribution where it is, but it's not the overall amount of carbon or organic matter stored in that profile isn't different. Similarly, for non-inversion systems versus plough, we haven't seen big differences or really any differences in the total amount of carbon that's there. Where, for example, at the Balrudri experiment, what we call the Centre for Sustainable Cropping, we have seen where we've added large amounts of municipal compost, up to 35 tonnes of compost a year for multiple years, we can increase the amount of organic matter, the amount of carbon, but then we need to think about what function that is delivering.
I'm going to go button with a question there. It's actually from the Taunton Mona's farmer, Richard Payne. I'll start with you, Rob. It's touching on public goods. Do you think zero or min-till would attract any payments in regards to runoff and soil contamination in rivers and the increase of soil biology. What's your kind of opinion on that, Matt?
Yeah, it's very difficult to say at this point, but there's a lot of suggestion that there will be some form of support for practicing no-till and other things. My concern is it will be a blanket application across all farms, and I think what we really need to understand is what soils or which soils need protecting more than others, and where these no-till systems work best, and where they can actually be detrimental to soil structure and a productive commercial crop.
Thank you. Your opinion?
Well, I think the messages that we've come out with is that there are and can be reasons to shift to less intensive cultivation systems, but I'm suggesting that for us, from the work that we've done, the reason to do it wouldn't be in the belief that you will get a lot more carbon into your soil profile. And that's not only our workers, but also elsewhere in Northern Europe. Examples from Laura Alakuku and the Finnish groups have been finding similar rotations to ours, the same sorts of results. So maybe some places in the world, maybe on maize and soybeans in the US, they do see direct benefits. But what the evidence that we have from Northern Europe isn't supporting it, that changing the cultivation system to a no-till will give you big improvements in soil carbon.
And do you think it's still a viable system, no-till is a viable system to use once glyphosate's been banned? Go on, one of you.
From my little knowledge of no-till, I think people will struggle. That's not to say they won't find some other way, whether it means a very shallow weeding operation, move away from a spray, move away from glyphosate, and to carry on not as strictly no-till, but as very, very minimal till, maybe.
I guess my comment to that is and my origins are Australian, as I've said, and there's been some recent work coming out where the controlled traffic groups in Australia are seeing some very good improvements in yield, but there are some groups, and the term they're using is strategic tillage, where they've had no-till for many years, and they have a problem with weed buildup, and then they are going and doing a cultivation as minimal as they can for weed control. So it's a case of not following the same recipe all the time, year after year after year. It's a case of switching on and using informed management and making decisions rather than just doing something because you've always done it.
I think going forward, there'll be a balance between organic and conventional when we're looking at things that work well on the organic side of things, and bring them across into conventional farming as well. So maybe more hoeing, more weeding in a conventional crop as well.
Yeah, I've got two very quick questions for you before we move on. One is just to clarify, the carbon messages slide that we're sat on now would suggest that ploughing is not detrimental to soil carbon levels. Is that what you're saying? Is that correct?
I'm saying that that we haven't seen, when we've shifted from ploughing to no-till or min-till, we haven't seen a major increase for these cropping systems. Now, if we change a lot of this, the work that we've done, for example, all that no-till work was on spring cropping. So if we have then significant part of the year where there is nothing growing and no roots in the soil. So I think we need to think about what we can do, as Rob referred to earlier, about getting better root proliferation. And if we have varieties, for example, that deliver better root proliferation, and root proliferation has been one of the things I've said we want in the soil, then we may see benefits. But as things stand at the moment, we haven't seen an increase in carbon, even after 5, 6, 7, 8 years of going from previously a ploughed system in implementing a min-till system.
Thank you. One more quick one before we move to your next point. What's your opinion? Does the amount of soil carbon, how much impact does it have on the crop yield?
It's not. I think I tried to say, and maybe I didn't say it very clearly. It's not just carbon. Carbon is a surrogate for organic matter, and the benefit from organic matter can be mineralization, the release of phosphorus and all the other elements, sulfur and potassium and all the other nutrients that the plant needs. The organic matter can have other benefits. It can make the soil stable, that will resist the stresses of compaction or erosion and these sorts of things. So it depends. There is an issue of the quality of the carbon or the quality of the organic. What's attached to the carbon molecules, the chemistry of that organic matter is important, and it's a point I will return to later in this talk.
Thank you. I'll pass it back to you guys.
So Blair, through one of the things we're looking at on the strategic farm this year is how deep we're working the ground in front of establishing a winter wheat crop and what effect that has on the rooting of that winter wheat. As I said, we're looking at 3 different depths, but we're looking over one variety in one 50-acre field. And I know you've looked at the effect between different varieties and different establishment regimes and techniques.
Yeah. Yeah, thanks, Rob. We have using one of the platforms, the platform at Midtown, which is on a very sandy soil. We've looked at the yields and it's only small plot work because if you're going to grow, try 30 different varieties, you can't have a hectare for each variety all replicated. So we've had to do it on small varieties, but we've done it for barley, and we do find, in general, we have found that in some of the non-inversion yields have tended to be lower than where we've ploughed, but where we've looked across the best yielding varieties or under ploughing conditions have tended to be the best yielding varieties under min-till or non-inversion systems. But not all varieties perform equally well. So there are some where the difference between plough and a non-inversion system is very great. There is some where even some quite good varieties where the difference between the yield under plough and the yield under non-inversion is not very different. And I think we need to think about how we're testing our varieties, how we're selecting our varieties. And I think that's why the sort of work you're doing, Rob, is trying varieties, even one, on different systems to see how they go. Because we've selected in this country, we've done our most of the breeding work has been done on ploughed systems. So we have bred for systems that like ploughed conditions. As we move and think about moving to using less fuel, to no-till or min-till systems, we need to think about what we can do to select crop traits, root traits that will work well under those conditions.
I think that's it's something we can certainly look at through the strategic farm program going forward. Is looking at how different varieties will respond under different establishment regimes and techniques.
Mm-hmm. So the other thing that we've done is using the platform experiments, and particularly this work that I'll now mention on this slide was done by colleagues as part of the project funded by AHDB at NIAB TAG, and particularly led by Nathan Morris, where they've compared yields under different cultivation systems, where they've had a ploughed system for a crop rotation, they've had a deep non-inversion, which was down to 20 centimetres and just a shallow non-inversion system. And they've compared yields for a range of crops relative to the ploughed system and the yield of winter wheat grown in succession compared to the plough. And the yields from the ploughed system have always performed very well relative to the non-inversion systems. But when you come to look at the economics, and I'm not an economist, so I probably won't be able to answer the detailed economics questions, but Nathan and his colleagues have done this very carefully and very properly, where they've looked at the lower costs under some of the non-inversion systems, that the return, the margin, if you like, the pounds per hectare or pounds per acre from these things over multiple years. This isn't 1 year. This is at least 6 years of data is showing that the best margins, the most profitable things, can be under non-inversion systems.
That's great. Whilst I was a monitor farmer, we for a few years we looked at the effect of having a green crop grown in front of spring crop, in our case spring beans and spring barley, to try and with the aim of conditioning the soil, possibly trying to dry out the soil and leaving it in a very good sort of condition to establish the spring crop into. We had some very mixed results on the heavier clays. We often found that having a cover crop in front of a spring crop could actually be detrimental to not only to the establishment of the following crop, but also harboring things like slugs. And I'm not saying we did it absolutely right, but I know you've done a bit of work looking at this as well.
Yes, Rob. So some of the work came from the Platforms project, and the Platforms project has now reported, and we'll say at the end, show where the whole report's available if anyone wants it. But following on from the work at the NFS trial, the New Farming Systems trial in the east of England, as I say, managed by Nathan Morris and colleagues at NIAB, they were able to tease out where they've had used a brassica cover crop before a spring crop, and they've looked at that under different cultivation systems. And the NFS site, while it's not a particularly, it's not light, it's not a particularly heavy system, so it's useful. It's a mid-range soil, but that they've been able to tease out, and there's some effects on yield data, and the changes aren't enormous. And then there's a cost, of course, of growing the cover crop. But I think this leads on to the question of getting our mind right and why we're doing it. But where they've grown the cover crop, so if you tease out the results, that they may not look much different, but where they've teased out the results and looked at the cover crops and the performance of the subsequent crop, the yield response, if you like, under a ploughed system, we can see that in multiple years, as you found, I think, Rob, that there can be negative yield responses to having had the cover crop in there, and only sometimes or rarely did they get a yield benefit. But under the shallow no-till systems, only rarely or once was there a detriment, and more often there was an uplift, a profit from having had the cover crop. So it's obviously, there are still a lot of things we obviously don't understand about cover crops, about the relationship with soil types, about the relationship with ploughing, and the questions about cover crops under ploughing is certainly a very important one that's been up for discussion.
Quick question there. Do you recall which cover crop mix was used a bit more specifically?
In the Morley site, I can't remember exactly what it is. It's brassica. It's a brassica, but the information is available in the Platforms project report that's on the AHDB website, and we'll give the web link, I think, or it's available on the AHDB website.
Fine, thank you.
We certainly trialled various mixes back when we were a monitor farm, varying from black oats and vetch, all the way through to multiple species mixes available from merchants, where you've got 6, 8 or more or more species in there. So we had a look at a few of them.
How did you get on with that? What were your conclusions?
Our conclusions were that we were probably spraying the crop off too late, and therefore weren't allowing the ground the time to dry out as it needed to before we went in with the drill. That was certainly one thing. So we were spraying off in January, February time, which was far too late. We need to be sort of trying to get the green crops destroyed in November. But then the problems that brings is that on the heavier clays, which everything's slow to establish on heavy clays, come November, if you've been establishing a crop at the very end of August or into September, come November, you have to actually decide whether there's enough of a crop there to warrant putting a crop in the first place.
Yeah.
So there certainly are a lot of questions that have come out from as people have seen the work on cover crops that's been from the News Farming Systems and elsewhere. And I think it's a case of getting an understanding why we're doing something. Just because somebody else sows a cover crop isn't in itself a justification for you to go and do it. It may be that you then ask why we're having. And we've seen the monitor farm groups asking a number of questions, and certainly following on from this work, we've been trying some work at the Balruddery farm of the James Hutton Institute. And the sorts of questions that the monitor farms asked and have asked for multiple years are, what's the soil water status doing? Is it going to be easier to plough? Is it going to be drier? Is it going to be harder to work? What erosion protection, if you're on sloping land like some of Rob's, it's a problem. How much benefit to organic matter can I see? The biology, we want a functioning biology, as I said at the start of this talk. We want our soil to do all these things. Can the cover crop help deliver on these sorts of things? And of course, can we see a yield benefit? And certainly the issue that we set up to try and address this, admittedly on our lighter soils in Scotland, we did set up an experiment to do this. And the experiment that was set up was based on the questions from the monitor farm, or monitor farmers, and we grew a cover crop. The first year was over the cover crop, and remembering we're in Scotland, so we're sowing much later for our cover crop than in England, and our cover crops aren't getting as big. That this was under ploughed, because where I am in the east of Scotland, ploughing the soil is still a dominant crop system. So we needed to ask a bit the question about what was happening under ploughed systems, and we did it at the scale where strips were 200 metres long and 6 metres wide, so that our combine gave us the barley yields. So we had a range of cover crops or a control with just leaving the stubble. And then in 2016, after the very wet 15-16 winter, we then grew a concerto barley. We went back in and put in 16-17, we put the same cover crops in and looked at their performance. And then in 2017, we grew concerto barley again and got the yield data. And we've done that in 2017-18 and 2018 data. And we can see on the left-hand side of that figure, we can see the barley yields, the yields of concerto barley grown after where we've had the stubble control. And we can see that there's in the first year, the results are a bit mixed. In the second year, certainly for some of the cover crops, the yield of barley following some of the cover crops, we do see an improvement in barley yield. So certainly this is on very light soils, but we can see in some cases under ploughed conditions benefits. And we're currently analysing the 3 very different years, because last winter we were going out and looking at our cover crops in March, and the beast from the east had come in and made a real mess, and These were never big cover crops anyway, and so they were most of them were very badly damaged. So we've seen over 3 years, and we're trying to bring together those results, and hopefully I'll get those out soon. Some responses in barley yield. In some cases, we have seen some drying. We've looked at earthworms and slugs, and we're making some measurements of nematodes, and these are taken from soil samples that were taken in March before the cover crops are ploughed back in, but before the barley sown. And perhaps in March, in cold Marches, you don't expect to see much soil biology active anyway, so we've only seen minor differences. We do see some cover, so there's some erosion risk. So if you want to put in the cover crop to help control erosion, there may be reasons to do that. But one of the things that is coming out, and my colleague Jean Robertson from James Hutton is using some infrared spectroscopy to look at not just the amount of organic matter, but the nature of it. And the diagram with the traces on it shows a red line, which is soil sampled after where the bare stubble has been, and the blue line is the trace for the soil that's been under one of the cover crops. And we can see the two lines often are the same because that soil mineralogy is the same, it's the same field, but we can see some differences, not necessarily so much in the amount of organic matter, but perhaps in the differences in the nature of the organic matter at the soil surface where the cover crops are. Now, this isn't taking the whole profile. This is just looking at the nature of the organic matter, and it might be quite labile organic matter in the soil surface. But we do see some differences. Certainly, in some years, there's a suggestion we're seeing. So we need to think more about when we're seeing differences in not only the quantity of organic matter, but the nature of that organic matter. And so we need to think about why we're using cover crops and what we're expecting from them.
Blair, I just want to go back a little bit and talk more about compaction. We're all too aware of the effect we can have with larger, heavier machinery at the moment. But what can you tell us about the effect of heavy rainfall events, heavy wet times of the year, not only from the rain itself, but also from waterlogging and other associated issues?
Yeah, thanks, Rob. We have been able to do some things. Again, having these long-term experiments, we've gone out and we've looked at the soil. Now, we haven't been able to do this in every year, and these are some data from the Midtown experiment, and we've gone out and looked at the soil condition in May after they've been ploughed. And there's a range of tillage systems, no-till, min-till, or shallow non-inversion, and some deep ploughing, and even different traffic where we've tried to minimize traffic, or we've even put extra traffic on. And we've gone out in May in 2012 after a dry winter. We've gone after 2 wet winters, and we've gone out in 2016 because the winter of 15-16 was by far the wettest winter we have in our 70 years of records at the James Hutton Institute. And we've done some very simple things, even in May, and the spring barley has been planted, so we've ploughed where it's appropriate or not ploughed. And all we've done is push the penetrometer like a needle into the soil, still rod into the soil, and seen how far that rod will go into the soil, how many millimeters it will go in before the soil gets hard. And so the blue lines, the blue bars, you can see that we can get the bar in down to 200 or 300 or even beyond 300 millimeters in most conditions, in most of those examples. But after wet winters or under very wet winters, we can see the soil becomes harder to penetrate, even in May, as a consequence of those wet winters. And it's that waterlogging that, even though it's a fairly sandy soil, things with so much rain, we've got waterlogging. We know that causes the soil to slump, it causes denaturing of the organic matter. The organic matter that we want to deliver these functions, it becomes denatured. We get anaerobic conditions, So we get all the things that we know, that not cold winters, but just very damp, wet winters where there can still be some denaturing. We get anaerobic conditions. The biology doesn't work. The earthworms get killed off. All these sorts of things. So we do see a response to the wet conditions. And I think for me, one of the things that these two fairly simple graphs tell us is the importance of trying where we can to make sure our drainage systems, be it surface drains, be it tile drains, be it mold drains, whatever's appropriate, but we do need to try and avoid, where possible, these waterlogging conditions.
I mean, this lines up with exactly what we see on farm, is that even when we are reducing our wheelings, we're trying to reduce how much we're on that land at all, and we have a nice autumn, and we go into the winter with soils in what I would consider to be quite a good condition. If we are then to have a wet winter and even a wet start to the spring, or a wet spring as well, then when we're back in late spring and the summer, we are of the opinion that we need to put that deep leg, that deep tine through, maybe only to sort of 6 inches, just to restore the damage that's been done, not by us with the wheelings and the machinery, but almost by nature. Heavy rainfall events, can have a massive impact on our soil structure.
I think it's a case of we need ways to better be able to think about that relationship between, for example, compaction and soil water status, how wet the status is. And I want to sort of start to finish off by just briefly mentioning a project that we're working on. There's a model that's freely available. If you Google Geronimo, it's on that slide. You can find it's a model to predict soil compaction, and it takes real agricultural machines. So you can take tractors of different horsepower or sprayers and these sorts of things, and you can not only take the vehicle, the machine, but you can take the tires and set the tire pressures. So you can select these sorts of things. And with, as you can see on that slide, many places around Europe are now starting to try and get their soils data in there. And we've made a start by getting some of the Scottish soils data in there. And we're now starting to think about about extending that now that we know how to do it. The model is based with colleagues at the University of Aarhus, because the machines, a sprayer in Germany looks very much like a sprayer in Leamington Spa or in Dundee. Yeah. So we can do that. Now the model is always being adapted as new tires, new machines come about, and we get more soils done. But it allows us to say what it allows us to take, for example, a machine that we have, to see what differences if we change the brand of tire or the type of tire. If we change the tire pressures, what effect that would have not only on the amount of compaction, but the depth of compaction, and also on whether we can run the model by putting in soil water for wet conditions or dry conditions or intermediate conditions. So Geronimo is a model that's being free to use. We're trying, with help from support from AHDB, to get the soils data in there. At the moment, you can manually put your soils data in. You need some idea of your texture, your bulk density, and your organic matter concentrations. It's ongoing work being supported by AHD, but it hopefully allows people to see, if I change a tire pressure, is it worth my buying a new supposedly better tire? Will I see a difference in the response of the soil to that tire properly inflated under my machinery? And it just allows and helps make decisions about trying to avoid those conditions, and say, okay, perhaps when it's really wet and I get red lines and red areas down to depth that would be so deep that I wouldn't be able to plough, maybe that helps me inform a decision that perhaps that's not a condition I should be working the soil. So I think there are the issues of compaction and waterlogging are interlinked. As I said at the start, we've seen where things go wrong. We can see some doubling up of you like of the problems. Where we get things right and we are managing things well, we can see a doubling up of the benefits. So I think that's probably close to where I'd wrap up what I have for this.
I've got a menu of questions for you both.
Okay,
here.
great. Fire away.
So it's going to be quick fire. First of all, I think this person knows you, Rob. How much are you looking into tyre pressures, Robert? I know you run a crawler for heavy draft and drilling, but for other secondary cultivations and rolling, etc., are you looking into adjusting your pressures?
Yeah, very much so. We've done a lot of research into tyres on some of the newer tractors that we bought over the last 3 or 4 years. We're a big believer in the new VF and IF technology we can get in the new tyres, particularly on the sprayer, which we leave on one set of wheels throughout the year, but also on the smaller tractors that we use for the rolling. We have to strike a balance between a safe tyre pressure for any road work and a sensible tyre pressure for the field work. We haven't got inflation systems on the tractors. We haven't gone down that route.
Is it something you look into?
It's all down to cost and time. The systems, as I understand them, are capable of blowing up a tyre in the field, but it still takes a very, very long time. And some of these big, on large high horsepower wheel tractors, if you're on 800s or 900s on the rear, they can still take 15, 20, 25 minutes to blow up from a field pressure to a road pressure. So at the moment, we think we're finding that balance. We can run lower tyre pressures on the new IF and VF stuff that we've got. So we can run lower pressures on the road and therefore not have an adverse effect in the field.
Can I just come in quickly there? Work that was supported under an arable link project, which involved AHDB and multiple industrial partners, Schaefer, Agco, Michelin, and was led by the late Martin Silgram from ADAS, looked at the effect of better tyres qualities, the Zeobibs versus the Agribibs on runoff and erosion for winter cereals, and the benefits from using the better quality tyres, properly inflated, were very significant. You could cut the amount of runoff and erosion and sediment transport by using the best tyres dramatically.
Right. I'm going to talk as if they're asking you this. We've done some organic matter testing on our fields, and even our poor fields have quite high organic matter levels. I suspect that this is because we're on reasonably heavy clay loam and that it has a high base level of organic matter. What do you think? Am I on the correct train of thought here?
Yeah. So I know Rob, as we practiced this, Rob told me he had jam on his toast this morning, and it's a bit like that for getting organic matter into soils. You want surface area. You want the organic matter spread over a large surface area. If you've got a large surface area, lots of bread and lots of thinly sliced bread, you can get more jam or more organic matter. So soils with lots of clay content have lots of surface area, and that surface area allows them to store and hold and bind more organic matter. So soils that have more surface area can hold more organic matter and will tend to hold more organic matter. And so the question is pretty well on the right track. That it's not that sandier soils will tend to have lower organic matter, and there is a relationship between the amount of clay and the amount of organic matter.
That's exactly what we've noticed on our heavy clays as well, where we thought the worst areas of the fields were possibly low organic matter, and we sampled. Actually, the organic matter is okay to actually quite good. So the fact that they're poorer performing fields may not be to do with the organic matter content. It may be something completely different, lockup or something else. I don't know.
Okay. Next question. Please help. We're doing that. Is that your wife? Please help. Gypsum. When is it needed, and what benefits to the high pH soil, and salty irrigation on potatoes this year? So, what benefits to the soil?
So gypsum is calcium sulfate. It can be sourced from a range of, but it's can be used from plasterboard is probably the cheapest one. Although if you buy it as plasterboard, you end up with a lot of paper coming in as well. The benefits from gypsum depend on a couple of things. First of all, there may be a calcium benefit or a sulfur benefit. So there may be a nutritional benefit from adding sulfur that the crop sees. And certainly the modelling work we've done in Scotland for adding gypsum shows that the benefits are often mostly from adding the sulfur. If you're on coastal soils where you are saline or sodic, then adding gypsum, the calcium will tend to replace the sodium and will tend to make that soil more stable. It will mean that when there's water on the soil, when rainfall dilutes the concentration of ions in the soil, then the calcium, being double charged, will hold the plates of clay together better. So gypsum can have multiple benefits, and if you are on a saline or sodic condition, then adding gypsum, the calcium will tend to coagulate the particles and make it, in the words we've used throughout this program, softer and stable.
Right, this is a bit of a mouthful. Thank you. This is from David Blacker, who was the York monitor farmer. Thank you for not swearing, David. Going back to cover crops and soil moisture, do you think there is a point where having the canopy intact for too long prevents the sun and wind drying out the soil, therefore leaving the soil wetter where the crop was and therefore more prone to compactionate drilling?
Yes, I would tend to agree with that quite strongly. I think in the experiments we did when we left the cover crop intact for too long, yes, I think it was a combination of roots and almost too much organic matter holding on to the moisture. Was there potentially the cover crop stopping the ground from drying out from the sun? Maybe, not necessarily in February. I don't know, February, March time. I don't know, but I think most of the moisture in our situation was held in the roots.
I think it comes back. We put probes into the soil to measure soil water, how much water is in the soil, and of course, if you've got lots of roots, the sensors don't just see the roots as water, because most of the plant tissue is water. So we can see that there's actually more water, and some of that may be actually held as root matter. That root matter may have other benefits, and then it comes back to the comment that yes, I think the questioner is right, but it's a question of what are we trying to get more roots into the soil to have to stimulate the organic matter and to stimulate the soil biology, and it's a trade-off. So I think the question is right, but we need to think. Yeah, it's a question of knowing why we're growing the cover crop.
I think where having a cover crop in works, and I don't think anyone could argue against it, is if you've got a long-term fallow, or you're leaving it heavy ground sort of fallow for the whole year, and then going back into another winter crop, and you want to take the moisture out of that fallow in sort of April, May time, then yes, absolutely, that's when it works. That's when it can help you get back on the soil a lot earlier and get it ready for a winter crop rather than a spring crop.
Rob, what would be your opinion on drilling dates for the different systems? So, for example, would you delay drilling for non-ploughing for blackgrass control? Do you think that will have an effect on yield, do you think, or what's your gut feeling on that?
Yeah, I think if you hold off for too long, you definitely get a yield impact. And on our heavier clays where we do have blackgrass issues, we're trying to find that balance between leaving it late enough so that we can get possibly another spray to take care of the blackgrass before we drill, but we don't want to leave it too late, because once our heavy clays are wet in sort of late September, early October, it's very unlikely they're going to become dry enough again to sensibly establish a winter wheat crop. So we're trying to find that balance, leaving it as late as we dare, but being able to establish a competitive wheat crop, because it's all very well controlling any late blackgrass, but if you then establish a very bad winter wheat crop that's not going to outcompete any further weeds anyway, you could be back to where you didn't want to be. So we try and hold off until the first week of October, but really once we get into October, we're looking to drill, because we don't want it to get wet.
Yeah. Any comment there?
Well, we're in Scotland, and conditions are we're losing daylight much faster. So it's a case for us of getting things in as early as we can, and we don't have the same. We have other weed problems. We don't have the same blackgrass problem.
Where should we go next? I've got one person saying they're going to hijack you here tonight. There, so you asked for your contact details. The same person, smart means Limex or gypsum to increase soil friability or ease of soil cultivation.
Well, if they want to hijack me, it's easy to find me. You put Blair Mckenzie and soil into Google and you'll find me. So gypsum, most UK soils won't benefit from the soil structural point of view from gypsum, because calcium is the dominant cation. Because the soils are younger, the calcium tends to be plenty of calcium in the soil anyway, that will aggregate the clays and hold the clay particles together. In my former life in Australia, where the calcium had over the hundreds and thousands of years that the soils had been in place, and sodium had been the problem, then where sodium was the main element that was holding the clays together, then adding gypsum was almost a routine thing to do. It was a routine thing to do. So I think it's a case of running some simple tests you can do to see whether you will benefit from gypsum. Take some soil and put it in the bottom of a glass with some good quality fresh water, not hard water, but some really good rainwater, and just swirl it round. And if it doesn't go cloudy, if the soil doesn't form a real cloud, then it's not dispersing, and then I would say you probably don't need gypsum.
Don't worry, gentlemen, we're nearly there. Can the microplastics found in some compost and sludges that are added to soil for organic matter, can that have effect on soil fauna, do you think?
I don't know of any serious work that's looked at microplastics. Certainly, the issue with adding compost is always how clean it is. Yeah. And we've got to the stage, even with some of the PAS 100 that we're still seeing, where we've taken municipal compost, we're still seeing non-arable weeds coming in through. Yeah. So I don't think with small concentrations of microplastics, I don't think you're likely to be detrimental to the complexity and the diversity of soil fauna that's in your system.
Going back to cover crops, what's your opinion? Do you think the yield increase is comparable with the additional cost of establishment of a cover crop?
If you're growing, so the work that I presented, which was work from the NFS system in Norfolk, Suffolk, east of England, the results are very marginal as to whether you see any benefit financially. But if this is where you need to be clear about why you're doing the cover crop. If there are additional benefits, if you're seeing an increase in soil quality, soil structure, soil health, if you're seeing benefits of corrosion prevention, these sorts of things, it's not just that one thing that may be there.
And I also think there's such a range of mixes out there, and you can buy some very, very expensive stuff, or you can possibly put your own mix together for a lot less money. So I think it's be realistic about what you want to spend. If you think it's something that's going to work for you, certainly go ahead and do it, but be realistic about what you want to spend on your mix.
Will soil biology sort itself out on its own if you get the soil physics and the chemistry right? Or do you need to make specific interventions to address soil biology? That's a broad question.
There are cases where one of my soil biology colleagues described as we have a functional extinction of deep burrowing earthworms in some of our fields, where we've had extensive cultivation, not only for cereals, but for root crops year after year, for potatoes and other root crops. And we've had so much change that the deep burrowing earthworms are effectively not in that field, or not even in some of the fields around. If with enough time, I suppose they would reintroduce, but it would take a long, long time. So some things will respond more quickly, some things will respond, but you can have long-term detrimental consequences by repeated excessive cultivation over many years.
Another question directed at you, Rob. Have you looked at nitrogen uptake and how it's been lost on your farm? Are these NPK trials you mentioned earlier in the talk a way of trying to increase nitrogen uptake in the plant as well as others? What do you think?
Yes, so to answer the second part of that first, yes, the NPK trials are possibly looking at addressing lockup that we're getting of certain nutrients, and by applying them, we can hopefully negate some of that lockup. We're high pH soils on a lot of the clays, which is potentially locking up some of the other nutrients, and therefore, if we can apply them out the bag, there may be a yield response there. I can't remember what was the first part of the question again. Sorry.
Have you looked at nitrogen uptake and how much has been lost on your farm?
We haven't looked at how much is being lost through leaching. I know the strategic farm in the east is certainly monitoring the outflows on their drains to see how much nitrogen leaching they're getting in the different systems. It's not something that we are looking at the moment, but with the water board certainly being interested in what we're doing and volunteering a pot of money possibly, it may well be something that we can get up and running in the 6 years of the strategic farm project.
Okay. I've got a lot of questions going on. I'm going to ask the last three in front of me, because otherwise we'll be here all night. I'm in northeast Scotland. Am I overworking the soil and mineralizing nitrogen to get wasted by 4-inch disking immediately after harvest, then again around now time, and then again in March or April in an effort to control cooch and wild oats? What do you think?
If you're doing the extra cultivation to get a particular problem in the short term fixed, then I think it may well be worth getting the weeds under control, and then addressing the other problem about how I get my the organic matter concentrations in my soil back up. You know, if you've got a bad cooch problem and you don't have a herbicide that's controlling it, then mechanical weeding is probably taken, but do it for only as long as you need to. Get it under control. Don't keep doing it, and then try and work it, and then try and rectify any of the damage that you've done to other things.
This may actually be a system that we have to look at in more and more detail over the next sort of 15 years or more. We may lose glyphosate. I personally think we will at some point, whether it's in the next 5, 10 or 15 years, I don't know, but I think we will lose it, or certainly have restrictions on it. And we actually may have to move to this CHAP system to control things like blackgrass for us and other things as well.
Do we need to re-inoculate the soil with bacteria and fungi with poultry muck or cattle muck if the organic matter level is low and I'm just using compost additions to the land at the moment? What do you think, gentlemen?
My reaction is no. The the microbiology, and it's not particularly my area of strength, but the microbiology has good recovery power. If you can build up the organic matter by growing cover crops, or by even by adding composts, there are opportunities for the biology to recover over time. We know that even in some of the most remote soils in Antarctica, we know that there are viruses that will survive. They will be there, and they will stay dormant until something comes along and gives them a chance to thrive. So I think the biology can recover under most of those circumstances.
Do we? Hang on, I've lost my question now. What is Rob's preference to incorporated muck from a farm that has always mucked and ploughed? Should we change this?
My initial reaction is no. I think if you've got a quantity of muck, either yours or you're bringing it in from elsewhere, carry on with that. Ploughing it down, I do have a slight issue with. We've always preferred to incorporate any organic manures that we've used, incorporate them into the top sort of 3 to 4 inches if we can. I worry that ploughing them down, particularly if it's farmyard manure with a high content of straw, that particularly if you're ploughing well, you just end up with a quite a dense layer of manure and straw at the depth of the plough. We've seen it before. We've dug it up a year later, and all you've got is a mouldy mat of farmyard manure, which is taking its time to break down. I think if you can disperse it and incorporate it into the top 6-inch profile, 4-inch profile, I think that's better.
Sorry, I'm just reading a question from David Blacker that I can't read on air. Final question from Peter is a cover crop capable of taking up, retaining and recycling an autumn applied manure to a crop drilled the following spring? What do you think?
Grey area, I think.
Yeah.
I don't think there's enough work being done on that yet. I think there is more and more work being done at the moment to quantify the value of a cover crop retaining nutrients, but I don't think we're there yet.
I don't think we have the data. I mean, certainly the Danes have done quite a lot of work on what we might call cover crops. They might call catch crops, where they're putting something in to try and stop nitrogen leaching. But I don't know off the top, without going away and doing some real searching, about whether we can see that benefit all the way through.
Okay, right. I think we've got our money's worth there tonight. Gentlemen, thank you very much for tonight's webinar.
Thank you.
Thank you. Pleasure.
I hope you enjoyed it, and we haven't scared you off coming back down this side of the border again, Blair. Just to let you know when the next webinar is, it's the 7th of March. It's Harry Henderson from AHDB. Harry's carrying on his series of machinery-focused webinars. We'll be looking at some information that he's gathered over the last year since we last touched on the subject. So we look forward to seeing you then. You'll all receive the invites as usual. I just want to give a quick thank you to my colleague Luke, who arranges these webinars and acts as a technical backup for us. Thank you very much, Luke. It wouldn't be possible without you. Final again, thank you, gentlemen. Really appreciate the effort. Judging by the amount of questions that are flooding in tonight, I think you've provoked some thought and had some really good discussion. Rob, thank you for putting your opinion in and being brave and coming on tonight. And thank you, Blair, for your input from your work. All that leaves me to say is thank you very much and good night from us.
Thanks for organising. Thank you.
Thank you.